Okay, let's get started. First, I'm going to apologize. I have that stupid cold that's gone around, and I'll get through this now, but I'm not in a issue. So this is Economics 313, Intermediate Macro. One day I did that, and I was in the wrong classroom. Good. I'm Mark Fella. My office is there. PLC 471. The office hours are there. It should also say or by appointment. Best way to get a hold of me is just send me an email, and we'll work something out so you can see me if that time doesn't work for you. You might have class or something like that. But anyway, those are the official office hours. You know I'll be there then. Phone number, email, web page, that sort of thing. So the usual info on the syllabus. The text we'll be using is this thing by Blanchard and Johnson. The first 13 chapters. I think there's some electronic versions floating around. Those will probably work just as well too. I don't think it's changed. This is the 6th edition. I'm not using the My Econ Lab module. This time is an official part of the course, but if you sign up for it, there's a lot of good practice problems and things like that. This is the first time I've taught this course in about 10 years, and I've never used this book before. It's what my colleagues use, and I wanted to use the same book so you can get used ones and that kind of stuff. But anyway, I didn't want to do all the My Econ Lab stuff, which goes along with this, and try to prep a new course at the same time. So the My Econ Lab was always homework you can assign, make it graded automatically. It makes my life really easy. Instead, I'll just write the homeworks myself, and we'll do it that way. And I'll get that done later. But if you want to do the My Econ Lab thing that comes with a book, you're welcome to it. That might help you. Just not going to be an official part of the class. The prereqs, you shouldn't be able to register without them. I didn't do any overrides, but you need 201, 202 at least. 311 is helpful, but I don't care if you have it or not. I don't think it's an official prereq. I don't know. Some people come up with these syllabi for all hour. The GTF is Evan Fuller. He'll be doing all the grading of the homeworks and the exams. His office hours are there. He can help you with homeworks and things like that. His email. He'll also meet you by appointment. I didn't write that down. So yeah, Evan's our GTF, and he'll do a good job. He's going to teach one day when I'm going to be gone. That's actually next Thursday, not this one, but the one after. I'm going to be at the St. Louis Fed visiting, so, or is it Chicago Fed? But that's the next St. Louis. So anyway, he'll do one guest lecture, but I'll be here the rest of the time. We'll have 2 midterms. They're given there. The first is October 24th and November 21st. Finals, not at 8 a.m., which makes me happy, until 1 o'clock on Wednesdays. That should work. So 2 midterms, final, the weights are there. I grade on a curve. Basically the way I grade is I just arrange all the scores from top to bottom, and I go a certain percent A, a certain percent B, a certain percent C, with some adjustment for gaps, you know, in the distribution. You can kind of see where the line should be. But basically it's just done on a straight sort of percentage basis. But we can talk about that more later. So it is a curve kind of a thing. There will be homework, and I'll assign those fairly often, and they will be graded. Evan doesn't have enough time to assign me. He has grades for 2 classes to grade every homework. So what I'll do is when the homeworks are turned in, I'll bring in a hat or something with all the numbers or the questions on them. And someone, whoever feels brave, can draw one out, maybe 2, and those are the ones we'll grade. And so the grade, the particular problems that I grade on each homework will be done at random. And you can work out the incentives on whether that's better or worse than grading the whole thing. So that's how we'll do it. That way I can at least grade these things and provide some feedback and get information who's doing the homework and who isn't, that kind of thing. What else? A lot of the Sorry, like I said, I'm not feeling well. We'll get there. Yeah, the grade of homework's will be 50%. There's 2 midterms, those will be 20% each, so 40, and then the final will be 45, is that right? Yes. And again, it's on a curve. And then I'll talk more about the kinds of things we're going to talk about in the class a little later. The other thing I do that I should talk about is I film each lecture. That's what the camera is back there. And I put them up on YouTube. And so you'll have the full lectures available. And students have found that really helpful, especially foreign students who have trouble with English. They tend to go back and watch the same section over and over until they get it. People tend to use the videos instead of coming to my office. If it's 10 o'clock at night and you want to figure out some section, it's really easy to go up on YouTube and just scroll. And you can figure out your notes about where that was in the lecture, just scroll and find that part and re-watch it. And you can get a lot of your questions answered that way. I'll also do these all on PowerPoint, and I'll post the full PowerPoint on their web page as well. So both the videos and the PowerPoints of each class will be on the web page. Now the videos create some weird incentives about not coming to class. And partly I'll offset that by having homework to do in class. And so you can always give it to your friend, I guess, if you and they can turn it in. But at least I can offset it somewhere. But let me just warn you against, I've been doing these videos for 4 or 5 years now. And a lot of students somehow think they can not come to class and they'll watch the videos later. For one thing, it's just a lot easier to take your notes here where everyone's sort of engaged and all their heads down taking notes and the roommates aren't there and the refrigerator isn't calling you and there's none of this other stuff going on, there's no distractions. Students tell me it's a lot harder to sit home in front of their computer and take notes just like it was a live class. So it's not a substitute, it's a complement. And if you try to use it as a substitute, I think you're going to get in trouble. Another thing people try to do is they try to wait till the midterm and they try to watch 12, 14 videos in one day. Because it's kind of like watching a TV series. That's not going to work for you either, especially since these are all going to be 2 hours long. It's sick of you one thing. So I just encourage you not to over-rely on the videos, not to think you can skip class, it'll be a substitute. And it's at the margin it affects attendance. I'm absolutely convinced that at the margin it has a negative impact on attendance. But I think the learning that people do from the videos is more than compensates. I think people have been learning a lot more since I started doing this, and that makes me happy. Particularly students who struggle a little bit tend to be able to just watch the same thing again and again until they get it. And that's a good thing. And so I think on net, they've been a very much a positive. But for some students that I don't want to go to class today, I can watch the video later, and keep making that choice. Or once made that one, keep making that choice over and over and over, it's going to cost you quite a bit. So anyway, that's your warning. Let's hope you don't fall into that trap. The course itself has a web page. You can link to it. They won't let me, they used to let me embed this page in Blackboard. Now they won't do it because they don't want anything inside the Blackboard. So all I can do is link to an external page. If you go to Blackboard, on the left side it says course web page or course home page. You click on that, it'll take you right to here after one more click. The address of the page is up there, constudent.typepad.com, economics 313. Probably if you just type economics 313 into Google and my name, it'll come right up. It shouldn't be hard to find. But I'm going to do all the communication with my class through blogs rather than through Blackboard, because I hate Blackboard except for the grade part. So the only reason I'm using Blackboard is so you guys can check your grades and see what your homeworks are and all that. It's really good for that. It's really lousy, I think, as a course management tool in other sorts of ways compared to what I can do on this. Little things like embedding video and that sort of thing is way easier for me using the blogging tools in this one. So we'll do that. What else? Each day before class, I will post something like this. I was a little late today. I didn't get this one up till today, 12:30. That's a little bit late. I should hide that time tag so you can't tell me. But I'll do these at least the night before, so you'll know what we're going to talk about that day. I'll try to do it a little bit earlier. Then later on, I'll post once the lecture's in, I'll post the PowerPoint And then the videos take me a long time to process. Just to get it off the camera into my computer takes a couple hours, and it's got to process it inside the movie thing, and then I have to send it up to YouTube and upload it. And it's about 15 gigs when it goes up. And so it takes a long time. Even at the university, it takes me a couple hours just to upload the thing. So it takes me a couple of days to get the videos out. And so just be aware that there's at least a 1 day, a day and a half, sometimes longer than that, because videos will go up on that. Also, each day, just throw up some extra reading. This is not part of the class, but just things I thought you might be interested in. On my other blog, I do this blog thing, it's called Economist We Do. And each day I do a set of daily ones. So this is about a third of the ones I do in my main blog. So I take all the ones that have to do with politics and I strip those out. These are just the ones that I economics. So I'll put a lot of those up. And each day what I'll try to do, once we get going, is start the class by talking about one of these and say, okay, here's something in the news that relates to what we're talking about. Let's take this thing going on out there. You know, they're going to change the federal funds rate, or they did some quantitative easing, they're going to taper, and change government spending, they raise taxes, and there's a sequester, there's a government shutdown, whatever it might be. We can use the tools of the course to sort of analyze what's going on and show you that the stuff we're doing actually does have some relevance and some ability to attack real world problems. I think that's something people really appreciate, is to see how the course tools can be actually used analyze real world problems and understand what's going on out there in the world. So I'll try to do a lot of that as well. If I've been doing this longer, this is good. So this is the other block. So I'll talk about that some other time. If you want to read it, great, but it's not part of the class. It's had 23 million visitors. I'm lost. Questions? Okay. One other thing I didn't really talk about was, it's a 2-hour class. So we'll break right in the middle, and I'll lose some of you. And that will annoy me, but I won't go anywhere. Anyway, so we'll take about a 5-minute break about halfway through. If it goes longer than 5 minutes, I tend to get annoyed. It's hard to get you back exactly at 5, but I like this break not to start extending. So I'm going to be pretty hard and fast about starting about 5 minutes or so after the break so that we don't get down. Obviously, I said David. All right, so let's get started here. So I went over the syllabus, I talked about the GTM. So let's do the introduction. So today is just a bunch of introductory stuff. We're not going to do a lot of theory, just sort of why study macro? Why should you even care about this course? So I tried to come up with some reasons. Just a little bit different. So what I'm covering now is chapters 1 and 2 in the book, and with a little bit of augmentation, I've added a little bit. So why should you care about macro? Well, one reason is to understand things that just happened. The output was going along, growing fairly well from 1984 up until about 2007. We called it the Great Moderation. We hardly had any business cycles. The volatility in GDP, the variance was about half its historical average. So we had hardly any variation. Things were looking really good, and suddenly we had this great big crash in in 2007, and we're having a really hard time digging ourselves out of it. And so what, employment's been a big problem, unemployment's been a big problem. So if you want to understand those things, we're going to have to look at the macroeconomic tools. And so it's going to help us understand the variation output, variation employment, variation unemployment. What causes inflation? How come when the Fed has quadrupled the size of its balance sheet for all these open market operations and quantitative easing, it's bought trillions of dollars worth of financial assets and added that reserves to the banking system? Why hasn't that been inflationary? Questions like that. What makes interest rates go up and down? If I'm going to buy a house, should I lock into a fixed or variable rate? That depends on my expectation of interest rates in the future. How do I figure those questions out? Well, macros can help us with that. It might help you with exchange rates, the balance of trade, but we're not going to do that. So in this course, I'm going to look at what they call closed economy macro. I'm not going to look at open economy questions about the exchange rate. We can talk a little bit about that, but it takes too long to do that. We have whole courses, and that's all that we do is look at those questions, 480 and 481. So I'm going to leave that sort of stuff to those other courses and focus on other things in here. So we're mostly going to look at domestic economy issues, but sometimes we'll have to bring in the international sector, and at those times we'll do what we need. If I want to talk about the effect of globalization in China or something like that on the U.S. economy, I'm going to have to say something about exchange rates and that sort of stuff. So we'll do a little bit of that, but we're not going to do that much detail. The main focus will be what determines output growth, the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, because those are really the most important variables for understanding the health of an economy. So if you want to know if the economy is doing poorly or if it's doing well, those are the main things that the Fed and other policymakers would look at, are those three sorts of variables. To do that, we're going to look at these. So the course, we're going to start off looking at the short run and what determines all these variables in the short run. So what happens to output in the short run, what happens to employment. Then we'll look at a medium run model. Then we'll look at long run models. So we're going to look at three different sort of sets or versions of this model. We'll start short, medium, long. And we'll start with a simple, very simple model like you saw in 202 and then build up to something more comprehensive. So by the end, we'll have a fairly complicated model that can explain quite a bit, help you understand the financial crisis or answer other sorts of questions. So the first part of the course won't be, well, today it won't be much theory, but as we get going, we'll do quite a bit of theory in here. But the point of doing theory isn't just theory itself. It's not just the theory. Theory is a tool that helps you understand the world. So what I want to do, this is the whole point of bringing in stuff at the beginning of class in the real world, is really show you how these theoretical tools can be useful for understanding all questions about monetary and fiscal policy. What if government spending goes down because of the thing that happened today in Washington, the government shutdown? That's kind of a big effect on government spending. If government spending goes down by $1 trillion, what impact would that have on the economy? How do we figure that out? How can we use the model to figure that out? What if taxes go up or down? What if the Fed changes the federal funds rate? There's been a lot of talk about the Fed raising the federal funds rate at some point. What's going to happen with those sorts of questions? We need models to understand it. And we'll have models that help with all of this. What's quantitative easing? How does quantitative easing work? The models can help us understand that quantitative easing works in several ways. It inflates stock values, it affects exchange rates, it can affect future inflation expectations, and there are all sorts of different channels that it works. Without a model, we're not going to be able to identify and understand exactly how QE impacts the economy. So we'll build models, make them more complicated so they're more real world, and we'll use them to sort of understand these important policy questions. And then also to look at real world events. What if things in the Middle East cause the price of oil to spike? What should we expect to happen in the short run, the medium run, and the long run? Will that lower long run growth? Will it be inflationary? What would happen to unemployment? Government shutdown. What causes financial meltdowns? How does this whole crisis thing happen? What does our model have to say about the crisis and how we should respond to it? Was it lack of regulation? Was it the interest rates were too low? Was it influx of foreign money? Was it foreign savings glut that you hear about? Exactly what caused the crisis, and how can the model help us understand all those questions? So I hope that we can do that. And we'll also look at other countries, to some extent, but not so much. I can get a country. I'm not going to start. I can see how. So let me try another question. So what is macroeconomics and how does it differ from micro? Remember this question? What's the main distinguishing feature between micro and macro? It's actually written. So if you read fast enough. Any idea? Is it size? No, it's not size. It's the level of aggregation. All right, so microeconomics is the study of individual decision-making units. A firm, a household, an individual person. Sometimes they look at some level of aggregation like a market for bicycles, things like that. We use aggregates a little bit, but mostly it's the study of individuals and how they make choices, how they make their economic choices. So individual economic decision-making units of some sort. So that's mainly what micro is all about. Macro is a study of entire economies. And what we're interested in is what makes, say, all prices go up or down on average. So if we look at average prices across the economy, what would tend to make average prices go up? Now, when inflation is going up, some prices are falling and some are rising. What's going to make sort of average price? What's going to make inflation? Inflation is a measure of the average, change in the average. So what would make the average level of output for firms go up or down? What would make the interest rate? Now, there's not one interest rate, but if we talk like there is in macro, there's one interest rate. We're thinking about all interest rates sort of aggregated into a single measure somehow. And we're saying, what would make interest rates on average go up or down? So in macro, what we study are these abstractions, these things. We're going to study GDP and the price level. But you can't go to the store and buy a unit of GDP and pay a price level for it. In micro, you study things you can go to the store and buy, bicycles. But in macro, no. So we're going to study these abstractions, the average level of prices, total output in the economy. And what we're interested in identifying is what makes the average level. If we're looking at total output, and on average is going up, then total output's going to go up. So it's telling us about what's happening on average in the economy. Same with prices. Prices is basically the average price of a basket of goods over time. How is that changing? So we're taking a whole basket of goods that a consumer might consume, we'll talk about this a little later, and we're aggregating into a single measure, calling it the price level. So some prices are falling and some are going up, but on average they're going up, and we're going to see that price level going up. Then we want to have theories about those aggregates. Okay, what is it that causes the price level, causes all prices on average to go up or down? What is it that causes output on average to go up or down? So we'll build these theoretical models that attempt to get at, okay, what's theoretically, what is driving movements in these abstract aggregates called GDP and the price level and the interest rate and those sorts of things that we don't really ever see in the real world. Talk about investment. There's not one investment out there. There's all kinds of investments. And we're interested in what's happening on average across all firms. So it's not size. Some firms are bigger in some countries in terms of their sales. But yet the study of the firm would still be microeconomics, even though it's bigger than some country. And the study of that country's economy would still be macro, even though it's smaller than a single firm. So the size is not the distinguishing feature between micro and macro, even though the names are implying that. It's just the level of aggregation, the study of these abstractions, and trying to model how those abstractions change over time. Oops. So how do we measure, you've seen this before, how do you measure GDP? So what we'll learn in a second here with an example I stole from the book is that you can measure GDP in 3 ways. Remember what these are? What's the definition of GDP you learned in 2? It's the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy in organized markets in a given period of time. So just total production of goods and services in the economy. You take the price of oranges times the quantity of oranges plus the price of apples times the quantity of apples plus the price of cars and the quantity of cars. You sum up all those prices times those quantities that were sold in a given year, and that gives you aggregate GDP. Now I added, this is the book's definition, I added the, oops, I meant to put the parentheses there, in organized markets, because that's an important point. The book doesn't have that in there, it should. Because home production doesn't get counted in GDP, because it doesn't pass through an organized market. So it has to be a formal market that somehow gets tracked by the government before it gets counted in GDP. All these, what we call unorganized markets, black markets, all those kinds of things, they're organized, it's just a name. Don't get counted. So that's. So one way to think of GDP is just the total value of goods and services, and there's real GDP and nominal GDP that may distinguish between. We could also do what's called a value-added approach, show you how that works. And then there's also the case that there's another measure out there called gross domestic income. So there's both GDP, gross domestic product, and GDI, gross domestic income. One is the sum of all incomes in the economy. One's the sum of all goods and services sold in the economy. We're going to argue in a second and show you those 2 things have to be exactly the same. So you can either add up all the income or add up all the output, and you'll get GDP or GDI. Now, when the government does is they actually do it separately. They don't come out quite the same. So there's a difference between them. They call it statistical discrepancy. That's just like some random error. They're not sure where it comes from. But the numbers are pretty close. But they're not always the same. So a lot of people, sometimes GDI is a little better measure of things. So some people look at gross domestic income rather than gross domestic product to measure where the economy's at. But we'll just use GDP. But the point is that you can measure, in theory, those should be identical. In practice, there's a little bit of a statistical discrepancy when the government actually does this measure. Because they're going out there measuring, they're trying to add up all the goods and services sold in the economy. They're also trying to add up all the incomes separately and get an identical number. Well, you can imagine. But they come out closer than you think. So they're pretty close. So let's just go through this, show you how this works. Okay. So this is an example from the text. You have 2 firms in this economy. And the first firm goes out and just grabs stuff off the ground, pays nothing for it, just goes out there and picks it up. It pays its workers to do that. It's going to pay its workers $80 to go out and pick that stuff up. They bring it back to the firm and they convert it into steel. And this example in the book has both workers and machines. We're going to assume no depreciation. So the only cost is the workers. The machines, we're just going to assume this cost is pretty simple. We don't have to do that. So this firm 1 goes out, makes steel, sells it to firm 2 for $100. And firm 2 is going to turn that steel into cars. So firm 1 pays its workers $80. What's left over is profit. So it either pays, so that it's sold for $100, right? So that's its output. Notice that it all goes to work. Income is the same as what they sold. So they pay their workers $80, that's their workers' income. Anything that's left over is the owner's income. So it must be income too. So that whole $100 is somebody's income. Then it sells it to firm 2. Firm 2 takes the steel, turns it into cars. And then It pays its workers 70, 30 in profit. So the question is, what's the value of GDP here? Is it 200 or 300? Should we add up the production in firm 1 and firm 2? Yes? 200? It's going to be 200. Because by definition, GDP is the output of the final goods and services, and steel is an intermediate good here. And so because it's an intermediate good, if we were to count that, we'd actually be double counting. And I'll try to show you that in a second. So the value of GDP here would be 200 in this example. So you can see that another way. So if you're still confused about why is it 300, maybe you're not. Imagine that the two firms merge. So now there's not a firm 1 and a firm 2. Firm 2 buys up firm 1. It's a vertical merger. And now they're just one firm. All the same number of workers and everything, they all do what they did before. It's just one firm instead of two. So now what do the workers of this one firm do? They go out in the world, they get stuff off the ground, bring it in, turn it into steel, and they take it somewhere else in the same building and turn that steel into cars. And they sell it for what? $200. So the output of that one firm is just $200. It shouldn't change GDP just because we did this merger. And so that intermediate good gets sort of subsumed within that single corporation. It doesn't get counted at all. So you don't want to count that intermediate good because it would be double counted. The $200 already has the $100 in it. We add it back in again. That's the standard way to do GDP. You could also, okay, so this is the merger thing. You get that, right? You could also do what's called a value-added approach. You know how this works? We take each firm and we say, how much value does it add to that lump of stuff that it gets? So what's the first firm do? It takes stuff off the ground or in the ground or whatever, brings it inside the firm and turns it into steel. So it takes stuff worth nothing, just laying around there, and turns it into what? Something worth $100. So its value added is $100. So firm 1 adds $100 worth of value to the stuff. Then what's firm 2 does? It takes something that was worth $100 and turns into something worth $200. So it also adds $100 in value. So we can add up the value added by the first firm, 100, the value added by the second, and you get the total value added, and that's another way to get GDP. The sit-downs use that approach to calculate things. So those two methods should be equivalent. After a merger, what would the value added be? 200. It took stuff off the ground worth nothing and turned it into a car. So the value added for that stuff is $200. Now the last thing is, do you remember how much we paid the workers in firm 1? 80. Firm 2. And then the profit was 20. So there was $100 in income generated by firm 1. What about firm 2? 70 plus anything left over has to be profit. So if we add up all those, a 70 plus 80 plus a 30 plus a 20, what do we get? $200 again. So we can also do GDP by adding up the income that each firm generates for its employees. And that's the income approach. That's method 3. So you just take the wages and profits for firm 1, the wages and profits for firm 2. You add all that up across the entire economy, and you have to get the same value for the equity. Now, it's a little bit more complicated when there's inventories involved. Like they pretend like the firm sells the good to itself. Because you pay the workers so they have income, but you haven't sold it, so it isn't sold. But in the national income accounts, they pretend like the firm sold it to itself. And so the sales and the income will always match, even when there's inventories. And so anyway, it's a little bit more complicated than inventories, but it all works out. So GDP, you can do 3 ways. Just add up the value, some of the PIQIs for final goods and services. You can do value added in each stage of production, or you can add up. And even if you had, let's see, how do I say this? Suppose you had other expenses. So it wasn't just wages, you also borrowed some money, so there's interest that you paid. When you pay that interest, what's going to happen? So your costs of production are now wages of 60 and interest of 10 and profits of 30 instead. When you pay that interest, what happens? That's somebody's income. So again, all the ways when you pay the cost of production, either you're paying another firm who's paying people, or you're paying people directly. And so it's always going to be the case that all your costs of production are going to end up as somebody's income. And then anything that's left over is your income as the owner. And so it always has to be that the income is equal to the value of what you sold. So you sell this stuff, either goes out as costs, which is your wages and other people's income, or it's left as your income as the owner. So it has to be. Our nominal and real GDP, again, we're just doing basic concepts today. I promise you it'll get more exciting. So what's the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP? What's the distinction? Why do we care? If you want to know how well the economy is really doing, which one would you look at? Real sensing. All right, so let's talk about it. So to get nominal GDP, what's called nominal GDP, we just do what we've been talking about. Add up all the prices times the quantities of all the goods in the economy. So if your economy produced 7 million goods, that N would be 7 million. And it'd be the sum of the prices times the quantities of all of those goods. That gives you the total value of production of every good in the economy. And that's what we call nominal GDP. Now, what would happen to nominal GDP if the next year every quantity was the same, but prices were double? Nominal GDP would double. But quantities, the stuff that people can actually consume, haven't changed one bit, right? Only prices have gone up. On the other hand, what if the P's stayed constant and all the Q's double? Nominal GDP would double again, but it'd be for a completely different reason. Now it's because we have twice as much stuff. Not that we're paying twice as much for the stuff we already have. So nominal GDP changes either because prices change or because quantities change. But that's not what we generally want to know about when we're asking how well is the economy doing. If nominal GDP is going up just because there's 100% inflation, that's probably something not so good. Nominal GDP is going up because quantities are doubling, prices are the same. Well, that's something else altogether. So what real GDP does is it tries to strip out the price movements and only measure the changes in quantity. And so somehow it has to, now we can't just add up all the quantities because it doesn't make any sense. Add apples and oranges. Right? So we can't just add those up. I had 7 sugars and 6 cars, and what's that number mean when you're all done? It doesn't mean anything. So it has to be a dollar value in some sense. It has to be a dollar value that only changes when Q changes. How do we do that? One thing we can do is fix a set of prices in a certain year. We can take the prices in the year 2005. And from then on, use those same prices and use the different quantities in every year. That's one way of measuring real GDP. There's a better way, we'll talk about it. But you can see that how that would then, the prices are by construction held constant. And the only reason, and the weights that you're using for each quantity are the weights that you have in it's what the good was worth in 2005. So good A is costs twice as much as good B. It counts for twice as much in your measure of real GDP. Same thing in 2010, because you're using those same prices. But what if those two prices are not the same in 2010? So there could be a problem with measuring real GDP in that way. But somehow we want to come up with something called real GDP, our GDP, that only captures the Q's and doesn't capture the P's at all as it changes. So how do you do it? With one good, it's really simple. So this is the first color I had in slide. This is, again, an example from the book. Now, if there's a single good, it's easy because I can look at just the quantities. The growth rate in 2004 to 2005 was 20%. The growth rate from here to here was 112. Depending on which base you're using. Using T-1 as the base year. And so it's easy to figure out with a single good economy what's happening to the real good. But the way they do it essentially is they take the price of cars in each year to get nominal GDP. So this is just PQ. It's the sum of the PIQI, but there's only one I. This is just that times that. 12 times 24 is 288. It's 12 times 12 is 144. Just double it. It's 288. So that's got to be 13 times 26 is 338. To measure real GDP, you do just what we just talked about. You can use the 2005 price. You use a single price. And you say, okay, let's take this price, 24, times that quantity, gives me real GDP for this. Since P is always the same, the only reason it can change is because Q changes. So then we take that times that, we get this, we take that times that, we get this figure. So what we can see is if you calculate this, real GDP grew by 20%. 2 times that's 48, add 48 to that, you get 288. So you get a 20% growth rate. So that tells you that was a pretty good growth rate. That's like, China on steroids. It's double their growth rate. That's pretty good. This is an 8%, approximately 112. Yeah. 8 times 12 is 96, close enough. So this is about an 8%, a little more growth rate. Again, in this simple case, you can also get that out of the Q's. So it doesn't really buy you a lot. We'll come to what happens if you have more than one good in a set. So basically, the idea is that to measure real, we fix prices at some base year. To measure nominal, we use the prices in each year. And we're usually interested in real GDP because what we care about is how much stuff people can consume, how many goods and services they have in their economy. Now, in this case, what if we use a different base year? What if we use 2004 and 2006 as our base year? Turns out it doesn't matter. In a single good, you're going to get exactly the same growth rate, no matter which base year that you use. Essentially, when you just look at the quantities, you're using a base year where the price was 1. So the choice of the base year is somewhat arbitrary. With a single good, you get the same real growth rate. Real GDP is just Q. Nominal GDP is letter Q. Okay. Now, what if there was more than one good, like in our economy? How would you measure real GDP? What you want to do is you want to take the sum of the WIQI. Before it was the sum of the PIQI. Now we're going to take the sum of the WI, some weight, QI. And what those weights should be in that sum of the WIQI, they should be the relative price. What you learned in micro is the price of A over the price of B. So the relative price of a good tells you how important. So if there were two goods, the weight would be just the relative price of the two goods. If one costs twice as much as the other, it should count twice as much. So the way they used to do it is they would just pick the relative prices in some base year like 2005. Whatever the relative prices were across the economy in 2005, they would use those to form the weights for real GDP. Then they'd use those same weights for about 10 years. Then every 10 years, they'd say, okay, you know, it's probably the case that the relative prices have changed over time in the last 10 years. So the relative prices we're using today are way out of whack to what they should be. So now we're going to use the relative prices in 2015 instead of 2005. The problem with that approach is it actually when you use these new relative prices, it changes every past real GDP measurement that you've had. So every time they updated the base year, the national income accounts, every past, back to 1947 when the data starts, or for GDP, goes back further, every measure changed. That means every regression that you did, every research paper that you did potentially has different results. That's not very satisfactory as a way to measure real GDP over time. So you with me? So the way they were doing it initially is they were saying, okay, we're going to measure real GDP using the relative prices in 1995. We're going to use those same prices for 10 years. And in 2005, we're going to realize, oh man, those are way off. So we're going to update them in 2005. Well, that means you have to backcast, go back and recalculate GDP for every year in the past using your new weights that you're going to go forward with. And you'll get different, because it's different weights, you get different totals. So real GDP, you go, I was in the recession, oh, it's not so bad because the base year, oh, it's worse than this one. And that's not a good way to do it. What they use these days is something called a chain-weighted measure of GDP. So you can do it's in detail in the appendix. I'm not going to do much with this, but it's called real GDP, chain 2005 dollars. Essentially, what you do year to year is you use the average of the relative prices in 2005 and 2006 to calculate that change. Then you use the average of 2006 and 2007. That's the chain part. Then you use the average of 2007 and 2008. So you keep using the average between consecutive years as your weights. So your weights are rolling forward with the relative prices through time. So then you never have to change your base year because it's basically the last year. You're kind of averaging the 2 years. And so they use this chain weighted index. And they think that's a much better way of measuring real GDP. So anyway, real GDP attempts to extract from price changes by using relative prices as weights. And it does that by using the average of those relative prices. Symbols. So I'll be using a single line is always real GDP. PT will be the price level, which we haven't talked about yet, and you probably ran into more than once in your economics courses. You probably know what the price level is about. And then PYT is nominal GDP. The book also uses a dollar YT, which I don't like at all, but oh well, as its measure of nominal GDP. The PY is much better. So price times income is what we're going to call nominal, and this Y is going to be And then just interchangeable things for nominal, dollar GDP, GDP in current dollars, nominal GDP, all those things are the same. A bunch of ways to say real GDP. I'll just say real GDP, so it's not that hard. We have a slide. What's the base year? Because real and nominal are equal in the base year, because the prices are going to be the same in the base year. So the base year is 2005. You can see you get a lot of differences between real and nominal, like in the 70s. Nominal, because of inflation, was really high. Nominal GDP growth was really high, but at some points, real GDP was actually declining, like in the 82 recession, there's the 73, 75 recession, 79. So you can see that even though nominal keeps going up, you miss all these recessions that you can see in real GDP. There's some real differences up here in the crisis if you were using one relative to the other. So, anyway, that's just a figure. The other thing we'll do with GDP is distinguish between the level of GDP and the growth rate. Real GDP per capita is just a measure of how much stuff you have per person. So that's an important measure of economic welfare. So real GDP per capita is just tells us how much each person has on average. The median average person, not the median average. And then we can also look at real GDP growth, which is just the percentage change over some base year. And that tells us how fast the economy is growing. And that's what most policymakers track these days, is real GDP growth. We'll try to maximize that. So we'll distinguish between the level of GDP and the growth rate of GDP. And for a lot of what we do, for a lot of policy questions, this is growth rate of real GDP. That's the most important learning. So here's the growth rate of GDP. Let's see. There's a pretty good recession. Big decline in the GDP growth rate. There's a 91 recession, there's an 82 recession, there's a 79 recession, there's a 73 recession. So you can see that recessions are when growth really takes a dive. But GDP growth is actually highly variable over time. It's quite a volatile series. And it's something you want to explain, because if you want to understand these recessions, you need to be able to explain why that number is changing over time. And so that's why a lot of the theories will focus on looking at what changes output growth and percent. These are year-over-year measures. So it's just the growth from, say, December to December. You guys are tired. So let's take a 5-minute break or so. If you ever need macroeconomic data, go to FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data. You've got everything. Just in the GDP and GNP section, there's 255 series. So you can get everything. It has 148,000 different time series. Anyway. I wish now that I would have used those graphs instead of the ones from the book. I wanted to use the book stuff. All right, let's continue with things you already know. How do you calculate the unemployment rate? So partly this is just to introduce the symbols we'll be using. So this is another important measure of the economy's performance. As I'll show you in a minute, it sometimes gives us a different picture than GDP. And when they sort of look at when this call recession, so they look at both the unemployment series and the GDP series. But this is just another way to measure the health of the economy. So we'll start with some definitions. L is going to be the labor force. That's not the population. You can have people both in the labor force and out of the labor force. We'll define the labor force in a moment. But it's basically you're either employed or looking for a job. If you're not looking for a job, you're out of the labor force. Is essentially it. So there's population, it's everyone, and the labor force is a subset of the population. Then we can divide the labor force into the employed and the unemployed. So it's sort of that's. Now this is the number of unemployed. So N is it's the number employed. I like E much better, but they use A. And U is the number of unemployed. It's not the unemployment rate. So that's just the total. The number of people in the labor force is equal to the number of employed plus the number unemployed. So that's the definition of the labor force. So how do we decide who's employed and who's unemployed? Now the unemployment rate is a little bit different measure. So the way they calculate the unemployment rate is they do a survey of 50,000 people each month. They call them on the phone, which used to have a bias because not everyone has phones. That's getting better. They use other methods too, but they basically survey 50,000 people each month and they ask you, are you employed? Yes or no? Yes? Okay, you're in the labor force and you're employed? Well, and to be employed, you just haven't worked at all during the previous period. Or at that time, sorry. If you're unemployed, means you're not working but you're looking. And you have to look for a job within the last 4 weeks. And then there's a little more to it. So if you're interested, I put it on the slide. You can look at it later. But you know, if you're working on a farm, you have to work at least 15 hours if you're in a family-owned business before they count you. If you're not working on a farm, if you work at all, those sorts of things. If you're like sick or there's bad weather or something like that, you're not working, but they'll still count you as employed. So they try to distinguish, the categories a little finer than that. Unemployed is basically you don't have a job, but you're looking within the last 4 weeks. That's all there is to that. And then to calculate the unemployment rate, hey, where'd it go? I left it out. I'm missing the slide. How would you calculate the unemployment rate? It'd be what divided by what? U divided by L. So it's the number of percentage of the labor force that's not working. So if your labor force was 100, labor force is 100, the number of people working is 80, and the number not working is 20. What's the unemployment rate? 20%. 20 out of 100 people in the labor force aren't working. So it's just a percent of the labor force. So the unemployment rate, there's a slide here somewhere. Did I delete it? So why do you care about the unemployment rate? Partly because it's a measure of how much people are suffering, both financially and psychologically, being unemployed, and so it gives you a measure of that. But it's also, this is probably the reason policymakers are using it, it's a measure of the inefficiency in your economy. It's a measure of how many resources aren't being used productively. So the unemployment rate's a measure of how many resources are idle that could be put to work. Now it has to be relative to the normal rate of unemployment. So if the normal rate of unemployment is 5% and your unemployment rate is 8%, 3% of your people are idle. You've got a sort of 3% inefficiency in the economy. For capital, they use something called capacity utilization rate. So there's this thing you can get called capacity utilization. That's the percent of trucks and factories and all that sort of stuff that they're using. The unemployment rate's the percentage of people that they're not using, essentially. And so those two things are actually pretty close. So there it is, the unemployment rate. I don't like that too much. Let me show you something else. So this is something I did I write for CBS News. This is something I did in 2009. I wrote this article. And the article was right after the recession started. It was all about how the economy might not recover until 2013, fully recover. And I felt like I was being the most pessimistic economist on earth at that time. My editors actually said, "Are you sure you want to say this? Like, we're not going to recover for like 4 or 5 years." Yeah, I want to say this. I don't think we're going to. But anyway, the point is that this is a picture of the unemployment rate, the civilian unemployment rate, accumulated rate. These shaded bars, so that's the Great Recession, this is 50,001, so these are recessions in the economy. If you look at this closely, you'll see that the unemployment rate generally peaks right at the end of recessions, and then it falls. See that? So in the past, it almost always fell right at the end of the recession. More recently, for the last 2 recessions, and here's the 91 recession and 2001 recession, unemployment, so this unemployment is still going up. It doesn't peak until several years after output has started growing again. So there was a real disconnect between the measure of output, which is getting us this far, and the measure of unemployment. The same thing happened here. You can see it broke a little bit at the end of the recession. There's a little bit of a break in the series right there, but for the most part, unemployment keeps going up for a couple more years before it comes down. And so it's not clear, if you're a policymaker, should you care about GDP, which is starting to go up again here, or should you care about unemployment? Now, I thought at that time that was going to happen again. So you can see the next picture actually isolates it a little better. So here's the last 2 recessions. You can see how far out unemployment keeps going and then how slowly it comes back down. It's almost like and then the same thing happens. So the question was, gee, it looks like the same thing's going to happen again. It's a couple of months past the end of the recession when output changed. Are we going to have the same thing happen again? But if you look at what actually happened with unemployment recently, this recession actually looked a little bit different. Here's the delayed peaks I was just showing you. This is the more updated data. Our more recent recession looks like the disconnect between unemployment and output isn't so bad in this recession. So one of the open questions is, what the hell happened here? Why are these two so much different? There's one back here that sort of looks a little bit like it, maybe a little bit here, but nothing like the delays we're seeing. Maybe we called the recession wrong. Maybe this was a much broader recession than we thought it was. That's one possibility. This is just a group of 4 people at the NBER making a decision about how wide this bar will be. Maybe they got it wrong. They basically look at 4 series and make a call based on those 4 series exactly what's going on. So maybe the recession, there is a break here, but this one is turning out to be different. I honestly thought we were going to see a repeat of this, that this was something new in the economy and it's being driven by globalization and technology, so that what was going on was when we were in the recovery phase, instead of rehiring people, they were replacing people with machines. Because it's hard. Someone's worked for you for 10 years. Maybe there's a machine will do their job. It's kind of hard to fire them. And then recession comes along. I'm sorry, I have no choice. going to have to get rid of you, and then you maybe put the machine in place, and you don't feel quite so bad enough. So maybe something like that was going on, which allowed output to recover faster than people. But we should see that again with all the robots. We're not seeing it. So that's a puzzle that we have. And it's also a puzzle for policymakers, because which series, if this is going to happen, you're in a recession and you're worried about this, which series should you watch? Should I cut the stimulus off here when output begins recovering? Should I cut the stimulus off here? You know, exactly what should you target as a policymaker? It's just not exactly clear when you have that disconnect. But fortunately, this time it's looking a little better. And I also thought that it was going to take a long time, but boy, I thought this is coming down relatively, kind of as fast as it does historically, not quite as fast as it came down after the '82 recession. The other thing to notice here is that unemployment in the recent recession isn't the worst we've ever had it, which is a bit surprising to people. The '82 recession was a little bit higher, up in the 10s after the '82 recession. We got right at 10 in this recession. So we didn't get quite the peak, but this one came down a lot faster too, and then it kind of stalled. This is sort of going down a little faster, but it's not that bad relative to what I expected. So unemployment's actually coming down relatively fast. It's the depth of the problem that's the issue. You can see we started from such a high base, it's going to take a while to turn it. What we don't know is if it'll start doing this or keep coming down. It's not clear. Part of what's been driving the decline in the unemployment rate is changes in labor force participation. So the unemployment rate is the number unemployed over the labor force. Part of what's been going on is changes in the labor force have been driving changes in the unemployment rate. And so, let me do this. I might have said something wrong relative to what they do. So the unemployment rate can change for two reasons. One, the number of people that are unemployed could go down, or the labor force could go up. So one of the things that's been doing a lot of driving of the changes in the unemployment rate is changes in the labor force. And so we're not quite sure how that's going to play out over time, whether we're going to see this big resurge. Right now there's a lot of discouraged workers, and there's a lot of people saying, I don't even want to search for a job. So they're out of the labor force. When that person comes back into the labor force, U goes up by 1 and L goes up by 1, and it turns out the unemployment rate goes up. When they go out of the labor force, U goes down and L goes down, that measure goes down. You can show that. And so part of the reason why unemployment's been falling recently isn't because we're employing more people, it's because there's been an exit of people from the labor force. So they just went home, stopped looking, and started watching TV and laying on the couch or doing something else. They enter the underground economy, they work in the black market, there's all sorts of things they might do otherwise. They might go live with their parents. Whatever they did, they did. What we don't know is going to happen over time is that as the labor market improves and the economy begins picking up, what might happen is that all those people that are out and laying on the couch might come back into the labor force and start looking for jobs. And that will make the unemployment rate go back up again. What that would do is cause this to sort of bow down a little bit and not, that could be what happens here, is that when things start getting better, people come back in the labor force and you see this thing start to bow direction a little bit. So anyway, it's not at all clear that that downward path is going to continue over time because of what's been going on in the labor force. And we're just not sure because the labor force has been changing partly because of demographics. We've got all these baby boomers exiting the labor force. We don't know how much of that exit in the labor force is demographic, for sure, how much of it is economic, just discourage workers. And if we don't have a good answer to the demographics versus economics, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen with unemployment over time. So you get lots of different predictions about the trajectory of the unemployment rate over time. One thing we can say for sure is that we keep up with the anemic job creation we've seen recently, like 150,000 a month. That's not going to be enough jobs to really bring that thing down fast. So population growth is about 90,000 a month. If you're creating 120,000 somewhere in there, if you're only creating 150,000, you're only employing a net 30,000 people from the unemployed. You have to at least keep up with the labor force growth. We've got, at one point we had 7 million unemployed people. We still have millions. If you're only taking 30,000 a month out of millions, it's going to take a long, long time. Some of these recessions here, like the 82, job growth was as high as 400,000 per month. That's why this came down so damn fast. This has been anemic. It's still coming down fast because of the change in the labor force. If that labor force participation reverses, then we're in trouble. So, policymakers need to understand all that. We need to have models that can capture this. Anyway, let's go to the boring stuff. I got a timeout. Okay, let's talk about, so we're just going through the measures that are the most important out there. GDP, unemployment, which are the things policymakers look at most. And then I tried to show you that sometimes there's a confusion between the two. So we went into detail. Here's how you calculate GDP, and here's how you calculate. But the bigger picture was, these are the things policymakers care about. This is how you measure them. And gee, what we were just showing is sometimes those two measures give you different answers if you're trying to figure out whether you should stimulate the economy or not. Sometimes GDP is going one way and unemployment is going another, and we're going to have to come up with, should policymakers increase government spending? What should they do when unemployment and output are moving in different directions in a post-recession period? Now we're just going to look at the other thing they look at and care the most about is inflation. How do you measure inflation, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it looks like. Oh, Songle, I see a typo. There's no Songle measure. What's a Songle measure? Why is it really show up in the room? All right, so what do I want to say here? So we want to measure, as I said earlier, the average price of goods and services in the economy. And there's several different measures out there. There's what they call the GDP deflator. I'll talk about that in a second. There's a consumer price index. And there's the PCE, which strangely the book doesn't measure, but it's what the Fed cares about the most. It's called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. It's another measure of inflation and the price levels. Let me explain what each of these are in turn. Which one you use really depends upon the kind of question you're asking. I have to explain that once we the GDP deflator, as it's called, is key. It's a measure of prices in the economy. It's the measure of the average price of all goods in GDP. So remember, GDP is consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Remember, C plus I plus G plus NX. We take the economy and divide it into households, they consume, businesses invest, government spending, then there's the foreign sector. We add up all those four things, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, and we get this thing called GDP. So each one of those, there's investment goods and services, there's government spending goods and services, there's exports and imports. This is the average price of that whole thing. So it's what you pay for a unit of GDP, in essence. So it's the average price of consumption, investment, government spending, and net export goods, foreign goods. And the way you measure this is very simple. You just take nominal GDP over real GDP. Remember we calculated those earlier? That ratio is the price level. So the math is easy. They use dollar Y. I don't like that. You just take PY over Y and you get PT. So that's nominal GDP. That's real GDP. Take that ratio. Y's cancel. And we're left with what's called PT. And that's going to just be, the, as I said, the average price of GDP. Often, though, what policymakers care about is not the average price of government goods and investment goods and foreign goods. They care about the average price of consumption, what households pay. That's what this CPI is. It's just, in GDP, there's C, I, G, and NX. The CPI is just the average price of consumption goods. It doesn't, throws all the rest out. And sometimes that's what we're more interested in. That tends to be what policymakers care about. So the CPI focuses just on the consumption component of output. I'll come to the PC in a second. Let me jump ahead of my slide here. This is the first year I've ever tried to use PowerPoints. So I don't know, it's pretty awkward. I like to use the board and write it all out. I thought I'd try the PowerPoint thing this time. Let's see how it goes. I'm not really good so far. I feel much more comfortable with the chalkboard. So the way you measure the CPI is you say, all right, what does the typical household consume in a typical month? What's that basket of goods? This much car, this much milk, this much cheese, this much rent, this much medical, this much dental, this much clothing. It's a whole huge basket of goods. And that basket is fixed. What they do each month is they go out to 23,000 stores in 87 cities each month. People go on a little computer and they price every good in that basket on every one of these stores. So in 23 different thousand places, they price milk. Then the price they put into the index is the average price over all of those. So what they do is the price level is the average price over all of those stores. That's how they measure this. See with me? So you go out, you take this fixed basket of goods, it's this many, this much time, and you go out and say, how much would that cost in this store? How much would it cost in this store? How much would it cost in this store? And you just take the average price of that whole basket. That's the price level. They actually define it to be 100 in a base year. So if 2005 is the base year and the average cost is 1,000, they just divide it by 110, so it's 100. So they sort of normalize it so it's 100 in the base year. Then you calculate how that price changes over time. So the next month you go do exactly the same thing. So the first month the average was 100. Next month you go and do exactly the same. You go all the same stores, calculate it all, calculate the average price of that same basket of goods, and then you 110. That's 10% inflation. That means the cost of the basket of goods that the typical household consumes has risen by 10% month to month. That's how they measure the inflation rate. It's the rate of change of the price of this whole basket of goods. So the total cost of that basket is 100, 110, 121, so on. You can measure the inflation rate by taking the percentage change in that price from month to month. Really? Every once in a while, they go out to the CPI, because we don't want to be using the same basket of goods we were using in 1930. every once in a while, they update the basket. You have to go back and recalculate it. You can't have problems with that because you have to do the basket. It changes everything. That's basically how we do it. Now, there's another measure called the PCE. And the CPI only includes goods that you purchase yourself, you actually write money for. The PCE includes things like, if you consume medical insurance and you didn't actually pay for that stuff that month, but you consumed it, that price is built into there. So it includes transfer payments and all sorts of other things. It's just a broader measure of the cost of living. It includes goods that people don't necessarily purchase for themselves. It's a slightly different basket, and they also use a chain weighting to avoid the problem I was just talking about where the basket changes every so often. They sort of let the basket chain weight over time. So this is a much better measure, I think, of inflation. The Fed thinks so. So this is what the Fed watches, this PCE. They actually use core PCE. We'll talk about that. Does it make that much difference which one you use? They tend to move together. The CPI tends to be more volatile, moves around more. Tends to go below and above than the GDP deflated. The PCE looks more like the CPI, a little bit higher, I believe, than the CPI. So you can see the inflation in the 70s. And this is the stable prices through here. So this is the inflation rate over time. So since about 1984, so this is what they call the Great Moderation. This is when GDP stabilized, as we talked about earlier. And the inflation rate's been about an average of about 2% over that whole time period. So inflation's been pretty stable. Then we had the crisis, and there was a period of deflation. You got negative inflation for a moment, and they brought it up again, but we're still a little bit below the Fed's target range for the CPI. So it was stable for quite a while, and then recently took a pretty big back. Tempted to pull up the PCE here, but probably won't know. The PCE looks roughly the same, you can see. It's a little longer series. Got to run up and then here's the 70s, 73 recession, we had this big inflation. That was the stagflation, where we had unemployment and inflation going on at the same time. And inflation rates as high as like 11, 12%. And it's pretty good, it's pretty stable, around 2.5% for the PCE. The CPI stabilizes at a little lower level because they're just different measures. This one's been pretty stable. Little run up prior to the crisis and huge deflation. This is when the Fed really got worried because they hate deflation. They think it's the really worst thing in the world. This is what motivated QE, was the fear of deflation. And they brought it back up, and then they haven't been able to bring it back up to target. And lately, it's been coming back down. And that's one of the reasons they probably decided not to taper. They really want to get this measure back up to 2.5%. Right now it's way below target. So unemployment's too high, inflation's too low, that means ease, further easing. And so had that been coming back up a little stronger, you can see there was a little dip here for the last few months. We thought it was coming up, sort of talking about tapering, but it's not. So output's tending to recover, unemployment's still having some trouble, they're still having some trouble with inflation, and so based upon output, they started talking about tapering, and they looked at the unemployment numbers and the inflation numbers, and they said, oh, maybe that's not such a good idea after all. And so, but it was really pretty stable for a long time. Oh yeah, why do we care about inflation? Who cares? If wage and price inflation are the same, so if all prices double and all wages double, who cares, right? Everything costs twice as much, but you have twice as much money, so as long as price and wages are moving together, what's the big deal? Well, inflation tends to have costs over and above those sorts of considerations. So one is what we call a transaction or venue cost. This used to be a big deal, but it's not so much anymore with computers and so on, but that's just purely the cost of calculating the price change. So if you're a restaurant and you want to change your prices, you're up on the wall and they're painted. First of all, you have to calculate what should they be. How much should they go up? Okay, that's 50 cents or $1, what's the right? And that's going to take some thought, some time. You got to redo the sign, redo all that sorts of stuff. So there's a transactions cost, or what they call a venue cost, to change the prices. It's just a waste of resources to change prices a lot. Now, these days, you can do it on computers. You can print a menu every morning on a piece of paper, slide it into some plastic, put it on the tables. So it's not as costly as it was at one time. But there's still a mental cost that goes along with it. It's also the case that if your prices are changing a lot, your customers tend to get ticked off. So another cost of rapidly changing prices, if you change prices a lot, you want coffee in the morning and it costs $2, you got $2 in your pocket, you walk in and suddenly it's $2.10. You're not very happy. It's like, okay, then I can't buy my coffee, and it's understanding coffee. So I don't like this at all. I'm going to go to another store that warns me well in advance. So consumers tend to like constant costs, constant pricing. They're changing them a lot. They're having variable. That can be costly as well. Most of this is just referring to the actual physical cost of changing prices. People on fixed incomes get hurt with inflation, so it's not so much a problem anymore, but it used to be things like Social Security weren't indexed for inflation. You got some fixed number, and when prices went up, it made the real value of that go way down. So anyone who has a fixed income in the presence of inflation is going to get hurt. It's basically a transfer of income. It creates uncertainty about the future, so people are less certain about what prices are going to be in the future, particularly if you have high variable inflation. And that makes people really reluctant to enter into long-term contracts. They might do it if you give them a variable interest rate. With a fixed, even then, they might be really more reluctant than if they knew what prices were going to be in the future, if they're going to be stable. But certainly for a fixed interest rate type contract, you would be very reluctant because of high inflation to sort of enter into that. You don't know for sure if you're going to win or lose in the future. You expect 5% inflation, if it's 10 you lose and 3 you win, what's going to happen? And that's going to make you very reluctant to do those sorts of things. It can also cause distortions. A lot of tax payments, like income taxes, aren't indexed for inflation. So when inflation goes up and income goes up, you get paid more, and you go into higher and higher tax brackets, but in real terms, you're not making any more money once you adjust for inflation. And that can cause tax distortions. But anyway, come back to all that. I have no idea what's next. A couple more things. So this is just how are the three things we've looked at: output, unemployment, and inflation. How are they related? And we're going to come up with some measures, some relationships that are very useful for policy. So the first is called Oakland's Law. what it tells us is how output growth, percentage change in output, and unemployment are related. So this is straight from the book. So on this axis is the change in the unemployment rate and output growth. So they're pretty closely related. That's a pretty darn good fit if you have econometrics. Probably haven't had it. The dots are close to the line. Fits well. R squared to the I. So what this tells us is that on average, when output growth is high, just what you'd expect, unemployment is low. More importantly, you can say that that slope is negative 0.4. So what that means is that if output changes by 2.5%, unemployment will change by 1%. If output changes by 1%, so if output goes up by 1%, unemployment will go down by 4.4. That's what that slope of minus 0.4 means. So if I just convert that, it takes a 2.5% increase in output growth to make unemployment go down by 1%. And so you can often use government spending multipliers to calculate the change in output over time. So you can say, suppose that government spending went up by 100, and the multiplier is 2. Then output's going to go up by 200. That's the change in output. Let's make it 250. Then I can calculate the percentage change in output. And that tells me exactly what I can expect. It gives me a prediction about what to expect about the unemployment rate. So it gives you a way to convert between changes in output and changes in unemployment. At the beginning of the crisis, when we were doing the stimulus package, people were doing exactly that. They said, okay, they spend $787 billion, and the multiplier is 1.5. GDP will change by this amount, so the percentage change in GDP is this. That translates into a percentage change in unemployment of this amount. When people are looking at the sequester, they say, that caused GDP to fall by this percent, therefore unemployment must have fallen by this percent. And so they use this relationship all the time to convert between predictions about changes in output and changes in unemployment. Most of our theories tell us how output will change. This gives us a way to quickly convert the change in output to the change in unemployment. It's just a rule of thumb, doesn't always hold. The dots aren't always on the line. Sometimes you can be pretty far off up there. For the most part, it's a pretty close knit relationship between these series. The other thing we can see here, where is unemployment stable? What unemployment rate gives you a stable, or what output growth rate gives you unemployment stable? So what we want to know is, that's where unemployment's not changing, right? That's stable unemployment. So you go over here to this line, you come down, and you'll get right around 3%. So what this tells us is that an output growth of 3% gives you stable employment. So if output growth is below 3%, like it's been, unemployment is probably going up, unless people are leaving the labor force like they've been doing. And if output growth is above 3%, unemployment is probably falling. Again, it's a rough relationship, not always working. Then that 3%, so what does that, so what we're saying is that output has to grow by 3% to keep unemployment stable. Why is that? Well, the first thing that has to happen, suppose population is growing by 1% per month. So you all are part of the population, you're going to exit the school someday and go hit the labor market. You'll be the new people out there. You're growing every year, the number of you. If the number of jobs are stable, what's going to happen to unemployment? It'll go way up. So the output has to grow by at least the rate of population growth and labor force growth to keep unemployment stable. Otherwise, there's no new jobs for the new people. So if labor is growing, you need output to grow too. So one thing that drives that 3% figure is just population. So if population growth was say 1%. Now the other reason is that what does productivity mean? When productivity goes up, that means you can produce what? The same amount of stuff with less inputs. So productivity is going up by 2%. What that means is you need 2% less people every year to produce exactly the same amount of stuff. So you also need to grow fast enough to compensate for productivity growth. So if productivity is growing by 2%, you're losing 2% of the people through that, and you need to keep up with population growth. So if you add those two together, you get the 3% output growth that you need for stable. Have you seen the Phillips curve?
Can you go back one slide? Is that realistic that the output keeps up with population growth? How so?
It has been. The way it usually happens is you just sort of replicate the existing economy. So you build a new subdivision, you get another 7-Eleven, and another gas station, and so you tend to sort of take the existing and sort of replicate it over time into a bigger and bigger thing. And that growth in output tends to match the growth in the population. Then you need a little extra growth in output to compensate for the productivity. Since the turn of the century, I don't know exactly what the population growth has been, but GDP growth has been around 2.5% to 3% for a long, long time. And for the last couple of years, last few decades, it's looking like it might be slowing down to more like a 2.5% rate. And some people are calling it the great stagnation. But yeah, for the most part, it has. Okay, so the Phillips curve. So who discovered the Phillips curve? Who's very interested? Phillips. So this person named Phillips, A.W. Phillips, oh, it's 58. I put 59, 58. He looked at the relationship between inflation, it was actually wage inflation, or we'll put it out, inflation doesn't matter, and unemployment. And these days, we generally look at the relationship between unemployment and the change in the inflation rate. So that's what this graph is telling us. It's telling us change in the inflation rate plotted against the unemployment rate. So it's saying that when inflation is high, unemployment tends to be low. When inflation is low, unemployment tends to be high. So there's this negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. That relationship is called Phillips curve. This fit, though, isn't quite as good as the last one, right? And those points that we're applying, that's not as good a prediction as the last one. There's nevertheless, if you run that regression, it's a significant coefficient. So yeah, so a couple things here. It's downward sloping, so it tells us there's a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. It's called the Phillips curve. There's a big fight out there these days about whether the Phillips curve actually exists. One side says no, one side says yes. We'll come to that later. I'm on the yes side. And notice that inflation is 0. Inflation is stable and unemployment is about 5 to 6%. So that's the way to define what we call the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is where prices are stable. They used to call it the NIRU, the non-accelerated inflation rate. But anyway, the way you define the unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment is it's where inflation would be stable. And so this tells us that on average, the natural rate of employment seems to be a little bit below 6%. In any case, that tells us that that's where inflation ought to be stable. So when unemployment's bigger than that, like it is now, that should be pulling prices down. Remember we saw that one graph where inflation's been going down? The Fed keeps fighting to get it back up. They're fighting up this way on this line to get unemployment down and inflation up. But right now we're actually out here where inflation is getting pulled down. So the change in the inflation rate is negative. We'll have a lot to say about the rates curve. Well, I didn't know if I matched my slides to the time. That's my last slide. I've got 1 minute left. I'm sorry I wasted it. Let's let you know that.